You ever been watching a show that you absolutely love, only for one tiny detail to completely pull you out of the story? Because that's exactly what happened throughout Season 1 of The Testaments. Now, don't get me wrong, I genuinely enjoyed this season. In fact, I think Hulu did an incredible job expanding the world we first fell in love with in The Handmaid's Tale. The performances were fantastic, the tension rarely let up, and several characters instantly became fan favorites. But loving a show doesn't mean pretending it's flawless. And that's where today's video comes in. Because once you start looking beneath the surface, you begin noticing little cracks in the storytelling. Some are simple continuity mistakes, others are timeline inconsistencies, and a few honestly make you stop and ask, wait, how exactly did that happen? Now, before anyone jumps into the comments saying, "You're nitpicking," relax. Every long-running franchise develops plot holes. That's almost inevitable when you're adapting novels, while also trying to continue a television universe that already changed several major storylines. Sometimes those changes work brilliantly. Other times, not so much. So today, we're breaking down 22 plot holes and continuity issues you probably missed in Season 1 of The Testaments. Some are tiny, some completely reshape how certain scenes make sense, and a few could have major implications heading into Season 2. Let's begin. Number 22, the Ardua Hall library that somehow isn't being watched. This one honestly bothered me more the longer I thought about it. Throughout both The Handmaid's Tale and The Testaments, Gilead repeatedly establishes one unbreakable rule. Women are not supposed to read, not even simple words in many cases. It's one of the foundations of the entire regime. Literacy isn't just discouraged, it's treated almost like a dangerous weapon, which makes sense. Knowledge creates independent thought. Independent thought creates rebellion. So explain this to me. Why does Ardua Hall, arguably the single most important institution for female leadership, contain shelves filled with forbidden books that trainees somehow keep getting close to? Seriously. Are you telling me the same government that amputates fingers for reading is suddenly comfortable leaving priceless archives sitting behind doors that aren't constantly under heavy surveillance? That feels incredibly convenient. Now yes, you could argue only trusted ants have access. But that's exactly the problem. Several scenes suggest young trainees can move around the building with far more freedom than you'd expect. If that's true, then Gilead is taking an unbelievable security risk. Imagine if military intelligence left classified documents sitting inside an unlocked classroom. That's basically what's happening here. It's not enough to ruin the story, but it absolutely raises questions. Let's talk about number 21. The Pearl Girls seem to have unlocked fast travel. I actually love the Pearl Girls as a concept. They're fascinating. Instead of conquering through violence, Gilead exports ideology. It's propaganda disguised as compassion. Brilliant concept. But the logistics? Not so brilliant. Think about where these women are traveling. Canada, European countries. Places openly critical of Gilead's human rights abuses. Yet somehow, the Pearl Girls appear to move between these worlds with remarkably little resistance. Where are the endless visa problems? The diplomatic investigations? The intelligence monitoring? Wouldn't governments keep constant watch over representatives from one of the most controversial regimes on Earth? Instead, the show often treats these international missions almost like routine business trips. And that's difficult to buy, especially considering refugee organizations would likely be documenting every single interaction. Again, it's a great narrative device. But the world building doesn't always support how easy those missions appear to be. Now here's where things get really interesting, because the next issue isn't about travel. It's about time itself. Number 20. Commander Judd apparently discovered the Fountain of Youth. I know, this sounds funny, but continuity matters. Visual storytelling matters. When a show repeatedly reminds us that years have passed, the characters should actually look like years have passed. Commander Judd plays a significant role in flashbacks depicting Gilead's early rise. Fast forward through political upheaval, civil conflict, institutional rebuilding, and somehow, he looks almost exactly the same. Now before someone says, people age differently, sure, but television has makeup departments for a reason. A few wrinkles, different hair, a slightly altered appearance, anything. Because audiences subconsciously use visual aging to understand timelines. Without it, everything starts feeling compressed. And once the timeline feels compressed, other continuity problems become much harder to ignore, which perfectly into number 19. June's front door has surprisingly weak security. Let's think about who June Osborne actually is by this point. She's arguably one of the most recognizable resistance figures connected to Gilead. Her face, her name, her actions, everything about her has become politically significant. She has enemies, powerful ones. She's survived assassination attempts, military operations, international conflict. So when mysterious items suddenly appear outside her home, the obvious question becomes, how? How does someone walk directly onto the property of one of the world's highest profile political targets without triggering obvious concern? Shouldn't there be surveillance? Protective monitoring? Neighbors keeping watch? Anything? Instead, the scene unfolds almost casually. It's dramatic, absolutely. Logical? Not quite. Sometimes television relies on visual symbolism more than practical realism, and I understand that. But this particular moment asks the audience to ignore an enormous security question. Now let's move from one security problem to another, because number 18 might be the biggest convenience in the entire season. Becca's impossible cover-up. This is one of those moments where emotion completely overshadows logic. And honestly, it almost worked on me the first time. Almost. After Becca commits a deeply shocking act inside her own home, the aftermath unfolds with astonishing speed. Questions disappear. Suspicion fades. Life simply continues. Except, shouldn't it? This is Gilead, a society built on surveillance, control, suspicion, neighbors watching neighbors, eyes watching everyone. You're telling me a violent incident involving an important household doesn't trigger an overwhelming investigation? No forensic interest? No reconstruction? No extensive questioning? That feels unusually convenient, especially because Gilead has never been portrayed as a government that casually overlooks suspicious deaths. Quite the opposite. Fear is maintained by making examples out of people, which makes the relatively smooth cleanup feel strangely out of character for the regime itself. Now here's one that genuinely surprised me, because it doesn't involve crime, or politics, or violence. It involves something much simpler. Number 16. Canada's medical reputation suddenly makes no sense. There's a moment where Canada is described as being medically behind Gilead in certain procedures. And I had to pause. Wait, what? Let's remember what these two countries currently are. Canada remains a functioning democratic nation with access to international research, global trade, universities, pharmaceutical cooperation, and advanced healthcare. Gilead doesn't. It's isolated, sanctioned, militarized, frequently dealing with shortages. Even if Gilead developed specialized procedures in certain fields, presenting Canada as somehow broadly primitive medically feels incredibly difficult to believe, unless the show spends time explaining exactly why. And it doesn't. That's the key issue. World building only works when extraordinary claims receive extraordinary explanations. Otherwise, viewers start filling in those gaps themselves. And trust me, fans always notice. Which brings us to our final point for this section. And honestly, it's one of the biggest continuity questions the season introduces. Number 15. Commander Judd's marriage timeline raises more questions than answers. Commander Judd is portrayed as one of Gilead's most powerful figures, a founding architect of the regime, a man whose influence extends into nearly every corner of the political structure. So here's the obvious question. If he possessed that level of power for years, why does it seem like certain marriage arrangements only become central to his story now? Wouldn't someone with his authority have exercised those privileges much earlier? Or are we supposed to believe circumstances suddenly aligned after all this time? The timeline feels unusually vague, and vague timelines usually create continuity headaches. Now, could Season 2 explain this? Absolutely. In fact, I hope it does, because sometimes what looks like a plot hole today becomes intentional setup tomorrow. But until those missing years are properly explored, this remains one of the more noticeable gaps in the show's internal chronology. And believe it or not, we've only scratched the surface, because the next batch of continuity issues doesn't just question character decisions. It starts questioning the very rules that Gilead itself established over multiple seasons. And once those rules begin bending, the entire world becomes much harder to predict. Because once a story starts bending its own rules, you stop asking, what happens next? And you start asking, wait, are the rules even consistent anymore? That's a dangerous place for any dystopian series to be. One of the reasons The Handmaid's Tale became so compelling was because Gilead felt terrifyingly consistent. The punishments were harsh. The surveillance was relentless. and every decision carried consequences. When those foundations begin to soften without explanation, viewers notice. Which brings us to our next plot hole. Number 14. Daisy's insertion into Gilead is almost unbelievably easy. Let's be honest, Daisy is not exactly subtle. That's part of what makes her likable. She's outspoken, impulsive. She asks questions. She challenges authority. In other words, she's practically the opposite of everything Gilead expects from one of its young women. So how does someone with that personality manage to enter one of Gilead's most elite educational environments without raising immediate suspicion? Think about what Gilead is. This isn't simply another country with strict immigration policies. This is a regime obsessed with bloodlines, family history, political loyalty, religious conformity. Everything is documented. Everything is investigated. At least, that's what previous seasons taught us. So are we really supposed to believe that no one conducted a thorough background investigation? No verification of her identity? No examination of her past? No questions about where she came from? That feels incredibly optimistic, especially when the future wives of commanders would logically undergo the most rigorous screening imaginable. Unless Season 2 reveals there was someone quietly manipulating the system from the inside, this remains one of the season's biggest logical leaps. Now, speaking of people slipping through the cracks, let's talk about transportation, because number 13 somehow makes crossing dangerous territory look easier than ordering takeout. The honey van that apparently has diplomatic immunity. I understand why the writers used it. It's visually memorable. It's different. It creates tension. But the more times it succeeds, the harder it becomes to believe. Remember what Gilead has always represented: paranoia, constant inspections, random searches, military checkpoints, fear of infiltration. So why does one ordinary delivery vehicle seem capable of moving through sensitive areas with remarkably little resistance? Wouldn't guards eventually recognize the pattern? Wouldn't inspections become more aggressive? Wouldn't someone think, interesting, this exact vehicle keeps appearing around major security events? That's how authoritarian states operate. They don't become less suspicious over time. They become more suspicious, which is why the honey van eventually starts feeling less like clever strategy and more like plot armor on four wheels. Now here's one that has divided the fan base. And honestly, I understand both sides, but I still think it's a continuity issue. Number 12. Garth's relationship with June doesn't add up. There comes a point where Garth acts as though June Osborne is practically a stranger, and that immediately raises eyebrows, because let's remember who June actually is by this stage in the universe. She's not an anonymous refugee. She's not some forgotten survivor. She's become one of the defining faces of resistance against Gilead. Her story has spread internationally. Governments know her. Refugees know her. Mayday knows her. So when someone operating at Garth's level appears disconnected from her reputation, it feels strange. Now yes, there are ways this could make sense. Perhaps he's protecting operational security. Perhaps he's intentionally withholding information. Perhaps he's lying. Those are all reasonable possibilities. The problem is, the show doesn't clearly communicate any of them, and when viewers are left inventing explanations themselves, that's usually a sign the storytelling left a gap. Now let's take that one step further, because the next issue isn't about Garth. It's about June herself. Number 11. June somehow seems shocked by information she arguably should already know. This one genuinely surprised me. By the finale, June has spent years working alongside resistance networks. She's coordinated operations, built alliances, shared intelligence. She's not disconnected from Mayday. She's one of its most valuable figures, so when certain revelations involving Daisy and Agnes catch her completely off guard, you have to wonder, how? Information like that doesn't exist in isolation, not inside a resistance movement built entirely on communication. If multiple operatives know, if Guardians know, if field agents know, how is June the last person to hear about it? That's difficult to reconcile. Unless, once again, someone intentionally kept her in the dark. But because the show never firmly establishes that, the moment lands as more confusing than shocking. Now, let's leave Canada for a second, because the next continuity issue takes us right back inside Gilead itself. Number 10. Where did all the handmaids go? This might actually be the biggest world-building question of the entire season. For years, handmaids weren't just characters. They were the system. They represented everything horrifying about Gilead. They were impossible to ignore. Entire households revolved around them. Entire political structures depended on them. Then suddenly, they're almost invisible. Now yes, the series briefly hints that policies are changing. Certain regions are evolving. Diplomatic priorities have shifted. I understand all of that, but infertility didn't magically disappear. The commander's desire for children certainly didn't disappear. So why does it feel as though handmaids themselves have almost vanished from everyday life? Even if reforms are happening, wouldn't we still expect to see them throughout the background? Wouldn't they remain a visible reminder of the regime's brutality? Instead, their absence occasionally makes Gilead feel less oppressive than we've been taught for years. And that's a surprisingly significant tonal shift. Now here's one longtime fans noticed immediately, because it doesn't just affect the present, it rewrites the past. Number 9. Hannah suddenly forgets something she already learned. If you've followed this universe since The Handmaid's Tale, you probably remember one very emotional detail. Hannah showed signs of learning to read and write. It was subtle, but important. It represented hope, a tiny act of resistance against Gilead's ideology. Fast forward to the Testaments, and that development seems to disappear. Instead, she's treated as though literacy is something completely new, almost like she's encountering the alphabet for the very first time. Now here's where adaptation becomes complicated. Margaret Atwood's novel presents Agnes differently. The original television series took another path. Neither approach is inherently wrong, but blending those two continuities creates friction. Instead of building naturally from Hannah's previous television arc, the show appears to reset aspects of her development so it can align more closely with the novel. That's less of a traditional plot hole and more of a continuity retcon, but viewers still notice it, especially those who've invested years following Hannah's journey. And speaking of character continuity, the next issue might be the most controversial one yet. Number 8. Aunt Lydia's return to power happens almost too smoothly. Let's think back to where we last saw Aunt Lydia. She wasn't simply enforcing Gilead's rules anymore. She'd begun challenging them, making dangerous choices, crossing lines that would have once been unimaginable. Those actions carried enormous risks. So when the Testaments presents her as one of the most influential women inside Ardua Hall, the obvious question becomes, what happened in between? Because Gilead isn't known for forgiving betrayal. It's known for punishing it severely. We've watched commanders lose status. We've watched women mutilated for far smaller acts of defiance. Yet Aunt Lydia somehow regains extraordinary authority with relatively little explanation. Now, could years have passed that changed everything? Absolutely. Could she have strategically rebuilt trust behind the scenes? Of course. But that's exactly the story many viewers wanted to see. Instead, we're simply asked to accept that the transition happened. And for a character this important, that feels like a major piece of missing history. But if you thought these continuity issues were significant, the final stretch contains the biggest timeline contradictions and logical leaps of the entire season. And trust me, some of them completely change how you look at the finale. Now, if you've made it this far, you've probably noticed something. Most of the issues we've talked about aren't the kind of plot holes that completely destroy a story. They're the kind that quietly chip away at immersion. The kind where, instead of focusing on the characters, your brain suddenly starts asking, wait, that doesn't seem right. And that's exactly why the remaining 7 are arguably the biggest ones of all. Because these don't just raise questions. They challenge the very internal logic that the Testament spent an entire season building. So let's finish the list. Number 7. The selective enforcement of Gilead's punishments. If there's one thing both The Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments have constantly told us, it's this. Gilead survives through fear, not kindness, not negotiation. Fear. From the very beginning of this universe, we've watched women lose fingers for reading, lose eyes for defiance, and suffer unimaginable punishments for even the smallest acts of disobedience. The regime doesn't wait for rebellion to spread. It crushes it immediately. Which is why Season 1 occasionally feels surprisingly inconsistent. Several young women openly challenge authority. Some talk back, others question orders. A few even participate in acts that should realistically carry devastating consequences. Yet instead of the brutal punishments we've come to expect, they're often met with stern warnings, temporary isolation, or a lecture. Now, I'm not saying every character needs to be mutilated for the story to work. Not at all. But the rules have to remain consistent. If the audience no longer knows what consequences exist, then the fear that made Gilead so terrifying starts to disappear. And once fear disappears, the entire foundation of the world becomes less convincing. Number 6. Paula somehow notices everything, except the rebellion happening in her own house. This one is almost ironic. Paula is portrayed as someone obsessed with order. Everything has its place. Everything has to be spotless. She notices the smallest imperfections. She's constantly managing the household, constantly supervising, constantly paying attention. At least, that's how the show presents her. So how does someone that observant miss major conspiratorial activity taking place almost under her nose? People move around. Secrets are exchanged. Suspicious behavior keeps piling up. Yet Paula remains strangely unaware. There's a difference between a character being deceived and a character conveniently overlooking whatever the plot needs them to overlook. Unfortunately, this occasionally feels like the latter, because if Paula is truly as meticulous as the series wants us to believe, she should have been asking questions much earlier. Number 5. Melanie seems to operate with unlimited freedom. One thing I've always appreciated about this universe is that politics actually matter. International relationships matter. Diplomatic pressure matters. Every decision carries consequences beyond individual characters, which is why Melanie's role occasionally feels a little too easy. She openly engages in activities that should attract enormous political attention. She's connected to anti-Gilead efforts. She's involved in incredibly sensitive operations. Yet she appears to move through Canadian institutions with remarkably little interference. Wouldn't governments be watching someone in that position? Wouldn't there be legal obstacles? Diplomatic complications? Intelligence agencies monitoring every move? Instead, the show often treats these operations as though bureaucracy simply doesn't exist. And while I understand why, it removes some of the realism that made this universe feel so grounded. Now let's move to a plot hole that's less about politics and more about communication. Number 4. Gilead's suspiciously efficient secret mail system. This one honestly made me laugh, not because it's bad, but because it's surprisingly convenient. Throughout the season, confidential letters travel between powerful people with remarkable success. Sensitive information passes from one location to another. Messages are hidden, intercepted, delivered, almost like an underground postal service. Here's the problem. This is Gilead, the same society that treats female literacy as a crime, the same society obsessed with censorship, the same society constantly monitoring communication. So how are all these written messages surviving the journey? Wouldn't officials inspect them? Wouldn't there be checkpoints? Wouldn't the eyes have systems specifically designed to catch unauthorized correspondence? Unless there's an enormous secret infrastructure operating behind the scenes, this part of the world building asks the audience to make a pretty significant leap. And now we arrive at one of my personal favorites, because this one combines world building, politics, and pure logistics. Number 3. The safe house paradox. Let's give Mayday some credit. They're resourceful, they're determined, they're incredibly brave. But sometimes, the show makes them look almost supernatural. Several safe houses